Hi everybody, I'm meteorologist Dave Hovde along with meteorologist Vivian Rennie, and we are going to put the season in review. This is KSBY's 2022-23 storm season in review, and there's a lot to talk about.
There is. It's been such a dramatic change from what we were seeing just last year and what we've been seeing over the last many years. We've seen a lot of rain, we've seen tornadoes, we've seen flooding, kind of anything that you can guess. We've seen it, so we'll talk about all of that.
Okay, so one of the things, and one of the reasons we decided to do this, we have received hundreds of questions about the season, about individual storms, about atmospheric rivers, and all of the components that went into what can only be described as an incredible and active year.
Absolutely. Looking at what we've seen over the last couple of months, even just 6 or 8 months ago, kind of seemed unimaginable. And so there is a lot of questions not only on what we saw, but what it means for the future, because this is going to be changing some things, but it's also not big enough to change everything. So there's a lot.
Putting things in historical context. So we're going to kind of tackle a lot of these by issue here, and then we're going to share some of our coverage that we've done over the course of the season as well. We want to thank all of you out there for, number one, being viewers and followers and fans, but also heeding these forecasts this year. We got off to a really tough start. We had some fatalities in the area. And of course, January 9th is the one that really kind of jumps to date. The season started earlier than that. But, you know, we're going to talk a lot about that January 9th storm. And that was just one of a number of big storms. But we started earlier than that.
Absolutely. And we have been talking about this, Dave and myself, as also with Taylor, about the difference we've seen in our viewers and the difference in response that we've seen from those first few storms to now with how we talk about these warnings and how we can feel these warnings here. But it started all the way back in early December, not at the beginning of our rain season. Our beginning of our rain season is in October. That's when our kind of water year goes from.
Right.
But this actually kind of got to a little bit of a slow start, but then we got to December and things got a little crazy.
Right, and so this comes up a lot. People try to extrapolate a season from the beginning event. So if you go back one rain season, we started really, really heavy in October and December. It looks like we were going to be off to a huge start in 21-22, and then literally everything shut off for months. We went from January, February, March into April, where almost no rain happened. But we got off to such an epic start, it made the season look okay. But again, there was that huge, essentially, setup to what was a very concerning drought going into this year. And like you said, this year got off to a slow start, but that really didn't mean anything.
Absolutely. When we were talking about those first few months of our water season, starting in those early days of October, we hadn't seen rain in months. We hadn't seen a drop of rain for months. That lasted all the way through October. A few storms in November, but kind of nothing. It was looking really concerning. Most of the state was in those extreme or exceptional drought categories, and it was just getting worse week after week. I was definitely nervous going into the start of this water season for reasons that definitely weren't actually what happened.
So let's talk a little bit about expectations. I think we set the stage by saying it was going to take several years to dig out of a drought that took many years to build. On top of that, it was a La Nina year, and we'll get much more into that. But I think the expectations really tempered that at best we would have some recovery, but it wouldn't be complete.
Absolutely, and I think there is still a lot of recovery that has been made, and even though we are out of those drought conditions throughout the majority of the Central Coast and the majority of the state, we're not out of the drought impacts that we've seen. We've been not only in those drought conditions, but also using up our aquifers for so long. Multi-decade droughts have really been drawing out that water, and that's not back yet.
Right.
We may be out of those drought conditions. We may have seen a lot of water. Lakes are filling up, reservoirs are filling up. Those aquifers aren't quite yet.
Right. So let's tackle issue number one, El Nino, La Nina. Let's start off with something fairly basic. What are those conditions?
So this is kind of a very broad term for the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So fancy words for we're actually not measuring what's happening here on the Central Coast. We're not even measuring what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere. That's actually a measure of the temperature of the water just off of the coast of South America, kind of near Peru. So that's actually what we're measuring, and how warm that water is dependent on winds, dependent on a lot of different factors, but that's actually what we're talking about when we're seeing El Nino, La Nina. It is impactful here. It's impactful across the entirety of the globe, but it's not an end-all be-all. Saying it's
Right.
El Nino, La Nina isn't going to say it's dry, it's going to be wet. There's super wet and super dry El Ninos, and also on the same side, La Nina can be very much one or the other.
Right. And there are other oscillations, the Madden-Julian oscillation. So it's a number of players essentially in a season that can affect what happens with the jet stream, the mean position or average position of the jet stream, whether or not storms are steered to you more typically or steered away. So statistically, over time, if you look at most La Ninas, they are drier than average, and most El Ninos. However, correlation is really interesting. El Ninos correlate pretty well to heavier than average rainfall, especially the stronger ones, but there's some question as to the epically strong ones. We had this mega El Nino that really didn't do a whole lot here in the West within the last decade. La Ninas are less predictive, and you can actually come up with really wet La Ninas. That's actually been the history here in California. So one of the biggest floods of all time was back in 1862. Not an El Nino year. So again, it's oversimplified, and part of it has to do, and we're in the media, but we're also scientists. I do think it's been just oversimplified to the point that it's almost nonsensical.
Absolutely, it is a player. I think we were talking about this earlier, that it is a player in our massive kind of ball game of what we're playing here with the weather here on the Central Coast, but it's not the end all be all, and it is just one of the many oscillations, one of the many patterns that we see. But I do think it helps to kind of see that it isn't as predictive with the La Nina, and it is a factor.
Right. So I'm going to use my analogy. I don't think it's a great one, and I've tried it on you.
I appreciate it.
Okay. So it's like asking the question, who's going to win the Super Bowl 5 years from now? But now it's time to draft, and you draft a quarterback in the first round. Does that mean you win the Super Bowl 5 years from now? Not necessarily. The quarterback has to throw the ball to somebody. What happens, injuries along the way? It doesn't tell you anything about individual plays in the Super Bowl 5 years from now. And again, it doesn't even indicate that the team that drafted the guy is going to be in the Super Bowl 5 years from now. But you certainly probably don't hurt yourself by drafting the guy in the first round. It's really interesting. And so, yeah, you have to talk about what happens as part of it's just a predictive factor. And there's a big difference, and help me on this, there's a big difference between what we do, meteorology, short-term forecasting, then there's this mid-range forecasting, which is essentially you kind of forget about some of the smaller details, you look at the larger players, jet stream position, things like that. And then there's seasonal forecasting, which is really similar science, but not the same.
Absolutely, and then even farther on the other side of that, we're all scientists, we're all looking at the climate, but then you look at climatology even farther. So we're talking about whether 8 to 14 days is kind of our absolute max.
Right.
But you keep going farther and farther. These are more players on that big scale. They're not players on individual plays, like exactly what you said. They're players in the game. They're not how the ball is thrown. They're not how these plays actually take effect.
Yeah, you don't know any individual, like El Nino doesn't say it's going to be heavy rain on the 9th of January. La Nina didn't give us any indication on date or much of the setup. It just kind of tells us where the players may or may not be. And in this case, we were looking at back-to-back La Ninas and this being a triple dip, but there was one thing that was predicted about this season, and that is that the La Nina was expected to wane late season, which means, and this is important, that these El Ninos and La Ninas have particular flavors, and this one was fairly mild.
Absolutely, and we were going to a rare triple dip La Nina at the beginning of the season, kind of calming down, so 3 in a row isn't particularly common, and it's starting to kind of go away. That did help. It did help set up those low pressures that really pushed a lot of moisture our way, especially kind of set up the players and set up the setup for a lot of our storms.
Right, and the thing is, if you don't get to study them frequently, they're not very predictive. So this triple dip was so rare, we really weren't able to kind of look into it and look and compare to prior triple dips, because there are only a few to even look at. And if you don't have enough, you really shouldn't extrapolate too far.
Yeah, that correlation and causation are not going to be the same, especially with such a small sample size.
So, and I really want to say this. Look, the folks who are working in the climate science area are definitely trying very hard to advance what is kind of a fledgling science. Additionally, too, when we look at, say, climatology, in other words, the records and how things have happened in the past, the onset of climate change has even changed climate forecasting. So upcoming seasons, it's become more difficult. So the science is in such flux right now. I know some folks are saying, well, you said this and it didn't happen. Vivian and I did not say. We definitely shared, I'm sure, that it was going to be a La Nina year. I don't think that either you or I said it's going to be a dry year. I think it's a concern that it might turn out dry, but really what we do is say what's going to happen in the foreseeable forecast, and then what we try to do is take these forecasts and things that happen and put them in perspective. That's why we're here today.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're hopefully going to be able to do with kind of what we've seen over the last couple of months. And one thing that I feel like we've noticed a lot is the atmospheric river. That has been a major player. Can you talk me through a little bit of what we're exactly looking at here on the Central Coast with atmospheric rivers?
So we're recording this late in March. I just shared a graphic today that showed that we've had 31 events this year in the West, in the Western U.S. 31 atmospheric rivers. And again, kind of like what we were talking about, El Nino, La Nina, they come in different flavors. Are they strong or are they weak? Okay, folks, you've heard this term before, Pineapple Express. The atmospheric river is the same thing. What it is an integration of moisture from the subtropics, and it can intermingle with storm systems and can bring them the kind of fuel they need. Typically what you get is low pressure dropping in from the north, it sucks up some moisture from the south, and this sucking up of moisture, the big southwest winds we get ahead of a system, these can be really juicy, and these atmospheric river systems typically are more than 1 day long. It's a bigger trough of low pressure, it sweeps up all this moisture, and it lingers in the area for several days. January 9th being one of them. You folks have been through a number this year. Now you know exactly what an atmospheric river is. You've lived through 31 of them in the West this year.
Yeah, a lot, and not all of them landed right here on the Central Coast. Not all of them were particularly strong, but they all have that same kind of pattern. We've got that big kind of super highway of moisture that makes its way across the ocean, hits us, and especially with some of our higher elevations right by the coast, it's that perfect sweet spot to, as that air hits our coast, rises up, and it drops a lot of that moisture. And that's what we've seen not only here, but also in that record-breaking snow in the Sierras. It's all part of kind of the same beast with a lot of this rain.
And we've also had another type of system a couple of times this year, these cold core lows, these really low snow level events, and thunderstorm and tornado producing events. So we just got through one here late in March, but it's been one of a number, especially that we've seen late in the season. Tell me the difference between, say, an atmospheric river system and a cold core low.
So one of the things that I really focus on is where these storms are originating. So we've got these storms originating for atmospheric rivers in the tropics, kind of have that Pineapple Express flavor coming up from near Hawaii. But then you have these cold core lows. Those are in the Aleutian Islands. Those are not as warm, definitely not as comfortable, all the way up there in Alaska. And it's pulling this polar air directly south, bringing in not only that cold air and a lot of rain, but also a lot of instability. They're not as linear or they don't have as much laminar flow, so it's not really pushing in one direction.
Right.
They've got a lot more spin, a lot more vorticity in them. And we've actually seen some tornado warnings on the Central Coast from these exact systems barreling down the coast. They're also a lot faster.
Right.
They're not these multi-day events that really slow us down, see lots more rain. But
these are the windier, deeper ones. You might have heard the term Bombogenesis, which really only refers, and again, there are some terms, I don't love the relabeling of everything. And Bombogenesis was a meteorological term that we just kind of threw out in the mainstream. But what that really means is just an area of low pressure that's deepening quickly over 24-hour time frame. And if it deepens quickly, it just means it's getting stronger. It can produce more wind. So what's interesting about these cold core lows is we've seen some extremely low snow levels. So while January 9th was sort of a record-setting kind of event for us in terms of rainfall, we also had the low snow level event that put some snow on the Cuesta grade. What's interesting, I've been here 20 years and I've seen snow here a few times. You've been here a short period of time, and welcome to snow on the Central Coast. What did you think about it? And you forecasted it. What did you think?
So I spent a long time forecasting that system, saying that they were going to fall lower than that. Typically, I'm looking at that about 1,500 feet threshold. That's kind of the top of the Cuesta grade. And I didn't quite believe it. I was like, no, not in this area. We've got enough warm air. And then even seeing that fall more and more and more, it was a little bit bizarre. Waking up on the Central Coast, looking up, even in San Luis Obispo, seeing snow on the tops of those ridges. Definitely bizarre, but we had the cold energy. We had a lot of those very cold conditions with that storm, and it came in kind of exactly as we were expecting, but it was definitely a little bit of a bizarre one.
Yeah, so those kind of systems, and they're fairly easy to kind of differentiate between just like a cold core system that would just produce rainfall or thunderstorms. For the coldest air to get here, these systems essentially have to back into the area from the U.S. landmass. Why? Because we sit right next to the Pacific Ocean. Now, for us, if you dip your toe in the water, you would say, wow, that water's cold. It's 53 degrees right now. Except that in the wintertime, that's an actually fairly warm temperature. And that's one of the reasons we don't get EF4 or 5 tornadoes here, because the atmospheric profile really requires a lot of instability. It helps if you start really warm and you get cold air aloft. There's a lot of contrast. For us, we've had these thunderstorm type events, these very cold events, but that's cold air up here with some ground motion to start things, but we don't get the big events. And again, the ocean water influence is a big thing. So you were talking about snow and just kind of not believing it. Almost every snow forecast I've ever done here is kind of a low confidence forecast down to 1,500. Above 3,000, feel pretty comfortable making these forecasts because, again, it doesn't seem all that warm in wintertime, but that ocean has such a huge influence. And definitely we can feel it in summer, right? Paso's 100 degrees, Morro Bay's 50 degrees. So people say no weather happens on the Central Coast. That's far from true.
Far from true, and we know those big differences. We know the impact of the ocean. We definitely feel it, like you said, in the middle of winter, in the middle of summer, when we have these massive temperature gradients, when it can be, even in the winter, it can be close to those 20s, maybe even teens in those interiors, a little farther away from that landmass. I kind of think of it as a sponge of energy. There's a lot of energy there, and it's going to cool down those temperatures at the coast in summer, warm it up in the winter, keep it pretty consistent. And that has really helped us, but it has also kind of hurt us, I think, over the last couple of months with a lot of that extra energy. Not only is it a really big sink of energy for temperature, it's also a sink of energy for moisture, and that has helped us out.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about rain, and we're going to double back on all of this because we're going to put some of these events in perspective. But temperatures, look, natural gas was expensive this year, and it's been cold for a long time. And we're through March now, we're into April, and it's still cold.
Absolutely. Those temperatures have stayed well below our average temperatures for pretty much the entirety of the region for months at a time at this point. That's definitely not helpful with the increased cost of living, increased cost of pretty much everything right now, but especially with these colder temperatures, they've stayed, at least for a lot of the time, over 10 degrees colder than normal for this time of the year. We definitely felt that.
Oh yeah. Okay, so you brought up something. I'm just going to do a little topic change on you here, and you brought up the word normal. And normal for the Central Coast, especially when you talk about rainfall, is interesting because you need to know a little bit about math. Normal is the mean or the average. If you take all of the rainfall years and you add them up and you divide by the number of years that you're inputting, you come up with an average number. Okay, so that's average. Why is average, Vivian, not a good number here on the Central Coast?
I, like you, really don't like normals here on the Central Coast because we don't really have a normal year. We can have those really dry years, we can have really, really wet years. There's not a whole lot in the middle, and there's a big changes continuously happening here. We do oscillate pretty insanely. This year has been kind of a unicorn rain year.
You've been using that word a lot.
But it's not the only time this has happened.
Right.
This isn't a once in a million year. We've had years like this before. We've had years like 1995 with just as much rainfall in pretty much just as many events. Right. And those kind of don't get factored in as much. They are normal here on the Central Coast, if we're using that word, but they're not as frequent as everything else. So it kind of sways the entirety of our perception away from those bigger events, even though they do happen.
Right. And I should say that while we're having this discussion, what we'll probably do is drop some graphics in that explain some of this. And then we'll be cutting this up and just dropping in little bits where Vivian or I explain something that we've talked about here on the show. So yeah, that's absolutely true. I think it's probably more helpful to just look by year and say, okay, this year you got 40 inches, and that year you got 30 inches, and this year you got 6 inches. It's really more interesting to look at the occurrences as opposed to the average.
Absolutely, that does make a huge difference. We all know that if you have one really big event and a lot of really little events, it's gonna get skewed. It's going to really take all of that out of perspective. I think it's harder here on the Central Coast. We have a lot more variability from our normals than a lot of other places.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we fared, both as people, infrastructure, and their longer implications of the kind of weather that we've had. Let's talk about people. Where we started the year, where we're at now. How do you think people did in general?
I think I may be very positive on this. I think as a Central Coast, we have banded together really well, but we've struggled. It's definitely been a hard year, especially compared to what many of us are used to here on the Central Coast. Going from a really dry, very sunny year last year to some of these really impactful events, it was a fatal year here on the Central Coast with many of our storms. That's not something we say a lot here. So I think it's been really tricky.
Yeah.
We've not only started off with some of those drier events, we've started off with lots of flooding. Even in December, there was floods that caused lots of really big issues. Over Christmas and over the holiday season, there was some big storms that really impacted people on the Central Coast. And obviously we can't go past this without talking about the several fatalities we saw here on the Central Coast on January 9th. Those were really impactful.
Right.
And they not only have put a lot of these big storms in perspective, but they put that direct correlation between what happened and what we can see here on the Central Coast. So those tragic events can't be overlooked, and I think they really have made a difference. Even looking at those events after, we've been taking a lot more caution. People are taking a lot of these events more seriously, and if there is even the smallest iota of a silver lining, I think it puts the damage that Mother Nature can cause here on the Central Coast in really good perspective on how it is this important thing to prepare for, and it is really life or death sometimes.
Right, so when we talk about flood advisories and flood warnings, and we always have to do a little bit of education because we don't get these events often enough. So we have to tell people the difference between a flood watch means flooding can happen, an advisory means some level of flooding is happening, a flash flood warning means it's flooding imminently right now, fast moving water and all of that. I think one of the human lessons we've learned, and I totally agree with everything you said, I think in general we did well. We learned some very hard lessons. But I would say that it shows that we're not immune here in California to the #1 cause of fatality when it comes to weather, and that's flooding. Even here in California, and what's again incredible is that this was not a risk. A year ago, we were begging for rain. And now we're begging for it to stop. So in terms of how we did, I think we did well. I do think psychologically speaking, I think we're getting to that point where people do want to turn the corner. Other sort of human impacts here, and we're going to get into infrastructure and other things, but look, it affected how people work. It affected the things that people can do. It affected recreation on the Central Coast. It affected tourism on the Central Coast. We're talking about, like right now, is spring break for a lot of folks as we go into late March and into April. And this used to be one of those places you could come and it was kind of pretty much a slam dunk. Usually you're getting out of it about now, though I'd argue March is not usually the best time here on the Central Coast. But yeah, I mean, there have been all kinds of impacts in terms of people that we've gone through. And I would say this, we're not done yet. Kind of looking at the forecast and being that this tape material, not getting into too much specifics, but we have other opportunities here that we can see. Nothing big. I do think we're kind of on the end. Would you agree with that?
I do think so. I think even when we're looking at those kind of seasonal forecasts, things that are not really necessarily in our predictive wheelhouse, kind of those farther away, we're seeing kind of a weakening of the overall pattern of that kind of continuously seeing these low pressures heading our way. That's weakening, I would say. But we're getting there. I don't think we're done though.
Okay, we're not going to dive into this. You can tell people what's coming next year. What's the word that's coming next year?
I don't even want to go. I think
it's El Nino, but there's so much to talk about. Hopefully you listened to us earlier. Okay,
hopefully.
Where do you want to go next? Lots of stuff on the table to talk about.
I think it's important to talk about how not only the people fared, because we have just had that conversation, but also how the Central Coast as a, for lack of a better word, landmass has fared, because that has been one of the places where I've at least been able to see the impacts of these storms most severely. It's really hard to drive around the Central Coast without seeing massive potholes, seeing closed roads, seeing bridges that have washed away, sidewalks that have washed away even. Right. And we're seeing stories about this every single day. So I think the infrastructure talk is important.
Okay.
Because it is important to see that we can build a flood-proof community.
It's just going to cost a lot of money.
And monies can be pretty tight here on
Right.
the Central Coast already. And we do have a lot of infrastructure repairs to do already because of this season. We've seen lots of road damages, things like that. But even going further than that, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to prepare for storms like this. But we also need to start talking about how to allocate those funds. Do we prepare, or do we focus on capturing these rainfall events?
Right.
There's a lot of ways we can go, and that's going to be tricky.
Yeah, so for one, I would have to say I really do appreciate the work that's been done by local agencies to close roads preemptively in a number of situations. Highway 1 was a big one, Highway 41, and a number of other roads, which, by the way, I think anytime that you get this sort of unicorn rainfall, it does illustrate where you've got some weaknesses in your infrastructure. I think the difficulty here, that it's more generalized flooding as opposed to flash flooding, is that there are so many problems that fixing all the problems will take time, and it's been so active thus far that we really haven't been able to get to, I'm going to say permanent, but it's not really permanent, semi-permanent fixes on a number of these things. And to just build on your point, I think every municipality has the choice. How much money are you going to spend, and where do you want to spend it? Do you want to spend it on preparing for other unicorn rain events? Because these don't happen often. We're talking about what's going to go down as one of the top rainfall years. Or do you spend your money preparing for the dry years? Because again, heading into this, that's all we were talking about was drought. Or do you kind of do a little of both? And I think that those are all big questions. And then each municipality is in a different situation. For one, they have different tax bases and all that. But secondly, some communities fared a lot better. San Luis Obispo had some difficulties, fared generally pretty well. But places like Paso Robles, huge pothole problem. And I mean, it's essentially on every single street. Where do you start? They just told us this week, here at the end of March, that they can only do patches right now. They've got to wait until it dries out to fix things. And at that, you know, things like access into parks, places that have, even these park roads have all washed out. So it's the infrastructure issue, and we're only talking about roads, not even talking about the power outages, this whole issue of trees coming down. We saw a lot of tree loss this year. You know, we're going to have to decide what we want to do about electrical infrastructure capability. Thousands of people out for significant amounts of time this year. So yeah, infrastructure took a hard hit, and we're just scratching the surface here, because you have to talk about these spillages that we saw at the lakes and the reservoirs, and we all did fairly well here. But wow, when you start talking about water capture here on the Central Coast, people get really upset when they see anything being leaked or allowed to leak out. But you have to keep a top on these things. It's like, you know, you ask the question, is the glass of is it half full or half empty of water? It's completely full, and more water is coming, so it's going to spill all over the table unless you spill it out. So it's a lesson for a lot of people about water management. From the governor asking everybody, 15%, you all got to save. And now we're saying, okay, well, we've got a lot of water, but the governor being reluctant to say that we're, you know, not out of a drought yet. And it's interesting because I think there's some nuance there, right? We are out of the short-term drought according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, but this aquifer thing is a big deal because development here on the Central Coast is tied in many places to the availability of water. So talking more about infrastructure, the second part of infrastructure is water capture and water management. And they're going to let water out of these lakes this year because they're not designed entirely for recreation. They're designed for agriculture use. And look, California has maybe the most impressive water supply and management system ever built. But it was built a long time ago, prior to a lot of these climate change scenarios. So what do you think about infrastructure? Do you think that a lot more needs to be done in that area? Statewide, certainly true, but what do you think about here on the Central Coast?
I think here on the Central Coast, we do have a lot of really good infrastructure that is here and is really helping to capture things, especially places like Lake Nacimiento. There is still space in that reservoir. It's one of the very few reservoirs that still has space, but there still is space. It's very well managed. I do think that now we're looking at places like Lake Lopez using its spillway for the first time in 25 years over the last couple of weeks. We are continuing to see usage of that. We're continuing to see those things and seeing the impacts going down those rivers. I think especially looking at places like Lake Cachuma and looking at those rivers going through areas including Lompoc all the way down to the ocean, that's I think where we do have the capacity for some improvements, especially places like the Narrows coming out of Lake Cachuma. Those places saw a lot of, for lack of a better word, action. They saw a lot of changes over the last year, and I think that's where we could do a lot of improvement. Also improvement in capturing not just in our reservoirs, capturing in fields, having areas that are allowed to let that water sit so it can percolate down to the aquifers. That is, I think, the largest place where we need that improvement, or we could at least see some improvement, is not just the reservoirs, but it's also those areas where it is allowed to be used not just with those reservoirs.
Yeah, I 100% agree. The governor has put some money aside for some of these projects. Some of this aquifer recharge you can do as you suggest. You let water sit around. It takes time. The other way you can do it, you can literally pump it into the aquifers, which requires equipment and infrastructure. So there's a lot of things that were talked about this year, and some things have been done immediately in terms of how water is managed. But I think other ideas came up through this year that will take time to initiate. But I do think for the next, we'll say unicorn again, unicorn rain event, hopefully we'll have more infrastructure in place to benefit even larger. But I agree with you. I actually think that the infrastructure here in terms of massive water management did pretty well. And again, that goes back to the people element. I think people helped a lot by heeding the warnings and advisories and staying out of some of these areas. And look, the bottom line is this is going to be a huge recreation year. The beaches were getting hammered almost exclusively over the last few years because the lakes were so low. Now the lakes are high, and now more people can come in, or the amount of people that would have come here anyways can go to more locations. This is going to produce money. The money is going to produce taxes. The taxes go to the communities, and a lot of these dollars will come from people freely spending this money here on the Central Coast. So yes, it's been hard. It's required a lot of patience, but there's going to be benefits here, even though we're going to be spending a lot of money fixing and thinking about future infrastructure. A lot of new money is going to come in also as a result.
Absolutely. It's also made, in kind of a more positive note, it's made the Central Coast look amazing.
Oh gosh, yes.
It is just so beautiful out there, looking at the rolling green hills. That's definitely something that I did not see when I first moved here. I saw the kind of dried, cured grasses, and we will likely still see some cured grasses over the next coming months, but we're looking at a possible amazing super bloom.
Sure.
There's already so many amazing areas of wildflowers, even right off the sides of roads, areas that have kind of been rejuvenated, including many of our trails once they're repaired.
Right.
But trails and things like that have been really helpful. I think on the whole, a lot of this has been really positive. Obviously, we're in a better situation in terms of that multi-year drought. Better situation, still not completely fixed, but I think it has made some really amazing improvements to us here on the Central Coast.
Yep. But when we're talking about things growing, there's a point when things warm up and then things start to die. And when they do, it's going to get brown around here. That is going to happen, and there's been a lot of growth this year. So we can transition and talk a little bit about fire. I'm going to rewind a little bit and say that one of the advantages we had this year with all the rain that we had is we didn't have a really recent burn scar, in that we didn't have to deal with a lot of areas that were at risk of big debris flow movement. That being said, we still had some, and we still had some for events that were quite old and we were dealing with, especially in Santa Barbara County, southern Santa Barbara County. And part of it is we build so close to risk. So, and we're going to talk more about cliffs and that sort of thing, because that's another thing we'll have to dive into. But we do build very close to risks, and we are going to be dealing with a risk this year in terms of wildfire. In my opinion, and I'm not a fire expert, but I've covered fires here for 20 years and several more when I worked in the Central Valley. You basically get two seasons. You get the flashy beginning of the season where it's the grasses that die first, and you get these short little fast runners. And then late in the year, after it's been dry and hot for some time, you kind of get these more brushy, higher elevation things in the Santa Barbara County Mountains, transitioning to fall. Climate change has definitely made a change here because it stays hotter longer into fall, meaning sometimes you have significant fire risk in October, in November. In fact, I'd argue those are the times I worry most, is prior to the first rain event or so. We've got some time here because right now we are still incredibly moist around the area with more cool air on the way. Things will turn. What do you think? Do you share my assessment of the fire risk this year? What do you think?
I absolutely do. I think that starting off, this is still continuing. We're still continuing those cooler and wetter conditions, but it is going to end. Eventually, I can't say when, but it will end. And at that point, we are going to start kind of that transition from these grasses. They are high right now. It's easy to see. That's going to start off with those first areas curing, starting to see those drying out very quickly. I think that could be a pretty major risk, starting to see that. And also this has increased a lot of the amount of vegetation available. So that is going to be even more areas of concern. On the other side of that though, we do also see a lot of improvements in the safety and the viability of many trees in our area. Many trees have been stressed for really almost a decade, especially as you head into those interiors with some of the worst drought over the last few years. Some of those trees have improved. They are going to have a little bit better fire resilience. I do think though that this could be a really impactful fire year because we do have so much vegetation that will be available, thankfully not available now, but it will be available eventually.
So I would say, again, the human lessons learned, keep listening to the folks who advise you on this. This is going to be a big year for clearing space around your house. Definitely try to manage dead trees. Those dry out the fastest. Those are dangerous fuel in the area. For what it's worth, a lot of sick trees did come down and been managed already. But yeah, I think this is going to be a big year for that. Okay, I touched on it. I know you've actually covered it. So the cliffs and the safety of places like Shell Beach. Look, you have storm after storm after storm, high wave events, and we have built literally to the edge. What are your thoughts about cliffside safety? What can be done? What's realistic? Because in some cases, you can't fix what's broken.
Absolutely. There's a lot of coastal erosion, and you just said some things you can't fix. It is already broken. We can't put up some of those bluffs where some of the benches, especially near Dinosaur Caves Park, we can't put those back up. That's not how coastal erosion really works. And we're going to be seeing impacts of that for a long time. I do think that it has put a lot of those properties that are right on those cliffs at even more of a risk. They're already at risk building that close, but these property lines are going to be pulling back further and further and further because of this. I think it's going to take a lot of money to shore up those public spaces, but I also think many of those communities and those homes right on the cliffs, they're going to have to take that into their own hands because we've got so much else going on, but these cliffs are going to need to be shored up quickly because a lot of this erosion is still continuing, and even if something hasn't already fallen,
that's where I was going.
It's already starting to get a lot more complicated, and it's a lot less stable.
A quick little note on that. That is, it doesn't need to be raining for you to have a weather-related event, correct? I mean, you can have a cliff fall 5-6 days after rain, gets in, it's working in through the ground, it finds a seam, it weakens an area, and you can get huge slumps. So again, this is a situation where it's helpful to know that weather risks are year-round. It can literally happen at any given time.
Absolutely, and even not just in the same weeks or in the same months as these storms, even as we head into a drier season, there's a lot of that erosion going on right at the base of a lot of these cliffs. So we're thinning out right at the base. We're thinning out where a lot of the strength of these cliffs comes from. So even things like building near them is going to be tricky. We're going to be seeing that instability even long after these rains have gone away.
Okay, so now it's time to talk about perspective. And again, a lot of people, we have stories where people say, boy, it's never been this bad. The problem with saying never is California has a long, deep, rich weather history. Going back to when it was, modern settled, but of course the native tribes who've been here for a long, long time. this certainly is not the worst rain year ever.
Absolutely, especially even looking back at some historic photographs. Our Janelle Padilla did an amazing piece talking about some of this historic flooding and talking about the comparisons between, say, now and back in the mid-90s. They saw some significant rainfall, and then even going even further back.
69 flood was
Absolutely.
incredibly profound, and it was a really, really wet March back in that year. And it wasn't the only wet year, month, by the way, back in 1969. Of course, the 1862 flood is a historic statewide flood that was a series of atmospheric rivers. There was standing water in the Central Valley. There was the big snow melt of 1830 where all the snow started melting out of the Sierras and ran into the Central Valley and essentially flooded the Central Valley. I'll say this of comparative, the problem is when you just look at the amount of rain you get per year, that is not always indicative of impact. If you spread it out, you can really mitigate some of these impacts. Ultimately, I think a lot of what we deal with is cumulative. So this year, our problems, I would argue, are cumulative. January 9th made it really bad, but this March 14th storm certainly doubled down on the places we were weak. But it was, the whole season. So, look, Cal Poly's somewhere on the order of 45 inches or so. You and I were just looking at some of the numbers. Rocky Butte has had roughly 8 feet of rain this year. Any other big ones jump out at you?
Absolutely. I think really a lot of areas just north of Santa Barbara, looking at areas like Lake Cachuma, they're putting up some really big totals to 40, 50 inches in some areas. And that's something we haven't seen last year. We're looking at less than 10 inches in many of these locations. So I think really looking at the tops of those ridges is where a lot of those really amazing rain totals are coming out of. Looking at those season totals, they look kind of unbelievable, but thinking out over those last storms, putting up 10, 11, 12 inches in some of these areas per storm has really added up, and I think that's some of the most amazing ones to see. And then even looking even further into the interiors of Santa Barbara County, looking at some of those mountaintops, not only did they see significant rainfall, also some of them saw significant snowfall. That one's a little bit trickier to measure because it is going to run off at a different speed than just a typical rainfall event, so that was kind of mixed in later on.
Right.
But some of those rain totals at those highest elevations, really impressive. And then also some of the canyon totals. I felt like that was also quite impressive. Looking simply at the difference between, say, the Cal Poly rain gauge versus the airport rain
which
gauge.
is almost 20 inches difference.
Absolutely, and that difference is not because there's difference in measuring, that's because of the difference in topography there. Poly Canyon is impactful.
Yeah.
It's a canyon, it brings in a little bit more rain, or at least it has been a little bit more rain specifically this season, but then even looking at just a few miles away at the airport, things are going to be different. And I know we talk about this every single time it rains. These rain totals are not going to be cumulative for an entire area. They are point by point, and there's some very significant locality changes, especially looking at places like looking at Atascadero versus Santa Margarita. Those are some really big changes.
Right. And so your totals versus what we share, they're certain to differ. I mean, essentially, whatever you measure is only accurate at the exact place you measure it. And so to what you were saying, that doesn't mean you're wrong, and doesn't mean we're even disagreeing. You just kind of have to understand that there's just high variability. I always say this about rainfall totals per event, that look, we're not trying to report the highest, because sometimes we won't hear from a weather reporter ever until they get 8 inches of rain, and then they'll say 8 inches of rain. That doesn't really help me. I don't know if on the lower days you're making really good reports or not. So typically the reports we like the most are the ones we get most often. And so that's National Weather Service, trained spotters. But again, that doesn't mean that whatever you are recording at your house is wrong in any way. So yeah, we get a lot of debates about that. The other thing, and I just want to say this in terms of how much we care. Vivian and I spend a lot of time, and I just have to say that Vivian has been fantastic since she's been here. We both kind of volunteer on weekend mornings because of the way our staffing works. Taylor can't do it all by herself on weekends, so we fill in by providing some perspective. So we actually spend a lot of extra time working on these numbers, sharing what we can. But we have arguably 50 to nearly 100 locations per event to tabulate, and then we get all of these viewer totals in as well. Then we get the request to put them in some perspective. And then, folks will say, well, what about this town or what about that town? Folks, I'm telling you, we have no bias. We do the best. It's just overwhelming sometimes to try to do all these calculations on top of being on as many newscasts. You are on Extra Newscast now. I'm on Extra Newscast now. And so a lot of what we do is actually forecasting is our primary thing. And then managing some of these numbers we have to do. The Weather Service, we love our Weather Service.
They're
office,
absolutely amazing.
but they have other focuses as well. So finding time to work on some of these perspective things has been a challenge, and especially during an active year.
Absolutely, it's been a challenge and also a privilege because we've seen how many people care so much about those rain totals, about their specific rain gauges, and I find them really helpful. Sometimes they don't make it into all of our coverage, but they are incredibly helpful, not only for us, but also for areas like the National Weather Service or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. They take all of that information and they start to ingest it into the kind of history of these storms. It's not just what happened, what they saw on their radar, it's also what you saw, and that also helps. The more information we get about this storm and the storms that we've seen this season, the more that they can ingest that into those overall predictions and overall understanding of these storms to make it better next time. So
I agree.
It is really helpful, and it is such a privilege to see how many people care so much. And definitely we care a lot about these storms as well. So it has been a privilege. It has been a lot though.
Yeah. I want to say one thing about forecast accuracy, because let's say you look back, you say, oh, well, I thought you guys said La Nina. That would seem like a negative mark against us. But again, as we've said, that's not really what we do. I'm going to say this, and it seems awfully self-serving. I think our forecasts have been excellent this year. Even January 9th, which was epic, we had an epic forecast out there. We had a big forecast. The March 14th system, I thought we did really well. The computer models we're dealing with, now there are more than ever, so it is, for one, it's buyer beware, and we're trained meteorologists, and so we have to pick and choose which models we like the best. I think the forecasts have been really good. I think the warning situation has been excellent in my assessment. And, used to be, I'm ancient, she's young. Look, we used to say, give you a high and a low, and not a whole lot of other information. Now we're breaking it out by hour, and now we're doing all kinds of different forecasting. So we're forecasting more than ever. I'm happy with how we did this year in terms of forecasting. How about you? You've issued forecasts, you've compared. How do you think you did? What grade would you give yourself?
I feel like overall we did pretty well. I think there definitely was some storms that surprised me still. I will be completely honest that there were storms that came in a lot hotter than I expected. But still, I do think that our overall patterns were great. I do think that overall a lot of the models this year fell a little bit short. So I do know that
that's the one thing I'll agree. So we get 4 or 5 models to look at. And usually we take that top one and say, I don't know about that one. So typically we don't edge higher. Over the course of the season, though, I started leaning my forecast to the hotter solutions. So when I say accurate, too, the other thing I say is, look, if we say Tuesday it's going to rain, it's probably going to rain on Tuesday. The other thing I think we've done really well at is trying to pick out that day 6-8 days out. And I think those medium range forecasts have been pretty good for planning. Like you, I don't like anything outside of 2 weeks. 14 days is at the edge. The only reason to ever mention them, I think, as you get into the kind of year we had, is we're so sensitive now. You've got to say, hey, 2 weeks from now, we can't, don't turn off the TV or the internet because you have something to watch out for. So I don't know. I agree with you, but I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
I absolutely think that it was a tricky season when we're looking at how our models fared, and I think even our models have improved, but I do think all of us have kind of swayed a little bit more towards those heavier solutions, and I think that has really improved, especially our later season forecasting, when we are looking at a season we haven't had in a really long time. I think overall, I feel like I did pretty good. Definitely not all wins, but
you did.
It was a good one.
You did great. We're really very fortunate to have you here. Okay, so before we go, I'm just going to let you know that what we're going to do here at the end is show you a montage, some of our best coverage of the year, some of the pictures that we saw, just some incredible stuff. We want to thank all the viewers out there for helping us out with the coverage. I look at this as a community. For one, we love our viewers. They're very, very loyal, but online, we just get so much great feedback. So my final thoughts are, you did a great job. We're very fortunate to have not only Vivian, but the entire news team here at KSBY, from the management, the reporters, the producers. They've just put in yeoman's work to cover things. And, and we want to hear your feedback. If there's areas that we can improve, we want to hear about it. This is a new thing we're trying between Vivian and I to try to add some perspective, and we'll probably do this as often as we feel we need to. But I feel very blessed to work with the people I work with and to work with Vivian. So those are my final thoughts. We made it through, and we hope that you'll stick with us. Your final thoughts.
I think it has been absolutely insane year. It has been crazy here in the Weather Center, crazy on the news side as well, and I'm so thankful to not only have this team. I couldn't ask for a better boss than Dave, and a better team here at the station. Our managers, our reporters, everybody has really had to band together like the whole Central Coast has. So I think this season is one that I'm not going to forget anytime soon, but I think it really shows how amazing this community is, the entirety of the Central Coast. I may be new here. I've only been here a little bit less than 2 years, but I'm so proud and so thankful to call this place home. A lot of family in the area, and I know that this community is truly amazing, and I am really thankful for this entire season, even thankful for some of the long hours. It's been very impactful, and it's a great place to be.
Thank you, Vivian. I agree. Fantastic. Okay, let's take a look back. Thanks for joining us for this special KSBY special on the amazing rain season we've had. But here are some of the highlights, and I guess you could say some of the lowlights and challenges as well. Again, thanks.
Good evening. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming with breaking news. It took me 2 attempts, and somebody had to come and pick me up to get up to the studio today. You're working from home. Nino wasn't able to get here. We've got crews spread out all over, working from various locations to try to kind of keep everybody up to date. So we're doing the best we can.
Now I want to show you some shocking images earlier today. That's the Montecito Creek. You can see why there is a level of concern.
Good evening. I'm joining you from Highway 101 near Avila Beach, where you may be able to see behind me the northbound lanes in this area are almost completely underwater. And from where we are standing, the scene paints a pretty clear picture of what happened earlier this afternoon. It came over here bringing objects along with it. They look like objects from another house. Maybe we see overturned patio furniture in this front yard. We even found a family photo, so sentimental objects just being washed away. We see things that look like they came from someone else's kitchen, a smashed salsa jar here, a cookbook left in the driveway here, filled with mud and water.
KSBY's Jacob Dizon joins us live with a look at the conditions in Montecito. Jacob?
I made it down to Montecito late this morning, and ever since then, the ongoing heavy downpour has not let up.
At 4 and 5, we were out here live showing you the damage after a large eucalyptus tree fell over South 4th Street, hitting part of this landscaping business across the street. Now we're going to show you much of the scene has been cleared.
KSBY News anchor Neil Hebert is live there. Neil, what's it looking like out there?
Yeah, Janelle, the rain is coming down pretty hard, and that, like Claudia mentioned, those wind gusts, every once in a while it just comes and hits you in the face. But if you look down to my left, this is Morrow Creek, right by the Silver City West Mobile Home Park.
The rain is just staying pretty consistent. It was a heavy about 10 minutes ago, lightening up a little bit. Winds are picking up. As you can see behind me, I'm standing in front of the Arroyo Grande Creek. The water is flowing. The water level's not so high just yet, but it doesn't mean that that's not going to stay that way, because the ground is saturated.